Hello, my name is Mahtab Mahboub. I'm a contributor to the Amargi and your host for this interview with Dr. Kamran Matin on the recent wave of protests in Iran. Dr. Matin is a reader in international relations at the University of Sussex, the author of the book Recasting Iranian Modernity, International Relations and Social Change. He has a broad media engagement and writes extensively about Iranian and Kurdish politics and is today with us to discuss the recent developments in Iran. Thank you, Dr. Matin, for your time.
Thank you, Mahtab. Thank you to the Amargi for organizing this conversation. Thank you.
As you know, the protest has entered into the seventh day now. What started as a protest of Bazaris in Tehran against the sharp fall of the currency value spiraled into a more widespread wave of protests across now 46 cities in 22 provinces. According to human rights organizations, by now at least 10 people have been killed, 80 arrested, including 9 women and 5 children. And the protest continues across different cities. So I think for many observers, it was not a question of whether, but when a new wave of protests would occur. I'm wondering if it was the same for you, especially in light of the 12-day war back in June when Israel attacked Iran.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, I think I was also one of those people who expected a new round of protests. And I think at least my hunch was initially that this round would be different, largely because while some of the structural dynamics behind the current waves of protest is similar, around essentially catastrophic economic situations, a general impoverishment of the population, unemployment, extreme inflation, low salaries, and so on. This time, all of this are still at work. But unlike previous times, this time there was no prospect of solution either for the population at large or for the government. And this has to do exactly with developments since 7th of October, but especially since 12 days war, after which, as you and the viewers know, so-called snapback mechanism was activated and UN sanctions returned. So the combination of broadened and intensified sanctions and a complete suspension of diplomacy or diplomatic talks around Iran's nuclear project between Iran and the US meant that both the government and people knew that there is really no way out. There is no possibility of solution. Even in the past, the positions of the two sides were quite far, but the very fact of some kind of talks and attempt to solve the issue might have given people some hope and therefore ability to absorb the enormous pressure of economic hardship which they were under. This time there was no such hope. Iran simply refused the conditions US had set for it in terms of abandoning enrichment inside Iran as well as limiting its missile program, both of which have become quite central to Iran's overall geopolitical and security strategy, as well as to some extent legitimacy and also deterrence vis-a-vis Israel. So I think that this is a key difference. And another key difference, I think, is the kind of ongoing and still incomplete impact of the 12-day war and the way in which it basically dismantled the edifice of unassailability of Iran's home turf, if you like, or homeland by US or Israel, the way a large number of most senior IRGC commanders were taken out, Supreme Leader had to go into hiding and so on. I think this has also shocked the military establishment of the Islamic Republic, and Khamenei himself, being quite old and probably ill, has also affected the whole process of decision making. And I would agree with many observers who claim that all major decisions have been suspended since 12 Days War. The government, the state as a whole, is unable to make strategic decisions, whether in terms of economy or foreign policy and so on and so forth. So yes, the protests were expected. How different they would have been in terms of how it started, or the widespreadness of it, I think is maybe slightly different matter, which we can discuss in the subsequent questions if you want.
I assume that the toll of these foreign policy adventures of Iran has taken now on people with this economic crisis, and I think for many protesters, it is a topic that they link what Iran has done in terms of foreign policy with what is doing it economically inside the country. Who do you see people on the street? Who are the main social forces that are on the streets now? We know that it is not all over the country, but it is rather widespread in a sense.
Yes. Excuse me. I think the point you made about foreign policy is really important, so I want to pause for a moment and say something about it. Historically, scholars of Iran and also scholars of area studies, as a field in academic world, have tried to explain, major political and social developments in terms of dynamics within a particular country. And Iran is no exception. And the book you referred to in the beginning, when you introduced me, was trying to actually challenge the suitability of such an approach. In fact, I would go as far as saying that many countries like Iran, which joined industrialization and modernization later in historical terms, if you like, actually tend to base their political legitimacy, I mean the state's political legitimacy, almost entirely, if not, or largely, on their foreign relations and foreign policy. I think a major example was Libya under Gaddafi, and to some extent Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In both cases, we observed a military elite which had come to power through coup. It lacked broad social bases internally. Therefore, it relied on radical foreign policy in order to create a legitimacy within the population internally. And in both countries, actually, they had large, oil resources, and they were quite economically well off. And still, they couldn't actually practice what I would call a hegemonic politics, in which consent is the main or the primary sort of instrument through which ruling elites rule. So Libya, for example, began to support radical movements across the world, from Palestine to Ireland. It tried to sort of replace Gamal Abdel Nasser's Pan-Arab project and become this champion of Arab nationalism across the Muslim world and so on. Saddam Hussein was doing the same with respect both to Palestine, but also, trying to reshape the Gulf geopolitics by invading Kuwait and trying to deal with Iran's regional preeminence and so on. Islamic Republic is very much the same, because it came out of a popular revolution, and I think that's maybe a major difference compared to those two cases. But the slogans of that revolution and the promises that Islamists made were completely unachievable. But the promises and the slogans of the revolution, as well as the ideals which revolution had carried with it was impossible to achieve within basically a capitalist economy which Islamists initiated after success of revolution. And the more the justice and kind of improvement in living conditions of the population was becoming impossible to achieve, especially following the war with Iraq, the more the attempt to legitimize the state focused on extraterritorial presence of the Islamic revolution, or the idea of Islamic revolution, the political Islam. So this combined with the fact that Islamic Republic refused to, as the phrase goes, socialize into Western-dominated international order, it was also worried more or less all the time since 80s, following the seizure of the US embassy by the Islamists in Tehran, that it would be subject to so-called regime change or some attacks. And therefore, the combination of a legitimacy deficit as well as geopolitical pressure, which it felt sometimes genuinely, sometimes fabricated by Islamic Republic itself, meant that the weight of legitimacy generating exercises were foreign policy. The creation or the support for axis of resistance, the constant talk of exporting revolution, and so on and so forth. And all this took if you like, a more aggressive and domineering turn after the Ba'ath regime was brought down by the United States in 2003. So the main regional barrier to expansion of Iranian Islamist project meant that Iran was now using this foreign power projection not so much as defensive and legitimacy making, but in terms of actually creating a hegemonic position within the region, which is why when following 7th of October, the axis of resistance fell apart under Israeli attacks, and then Assad regime fell, this whole arena of Islamic Republic's legitimacy production basically disappeared. So the current protests occurred at the time that not only economic ideals of the revolution were, anything but achieved, but the situation had extremely deteriorated. And at the same time, Islamic Republic had no longer any of its regional and international sources of power projection on the basis on which at least it could convince its own supporters that, okay, we are in a hard, difficult situation, but we are, in the long run, we are the winners and we are moving forward and so on. The role of foreign policy in what's going on now is well beyond simply conjunctural impact. It's a very structural and goes to the heart of the post-revolutionary order. In terms of the difference, as you mentioned, the protest began from Bazaar, which is, the Farsi word for basically market area. It refers to retail sector, the shops and so on. But actually, within the Iranian political economy, Bazaar stands for much more than what the actual word suggests in English. It refers to a particular social class which, given Iran's long history of being at the heart of a extensive regional network of trade, has been historically very influential. And this social stratum of Bazaris, i.e. the merchants, were religiously conservative as well as politically, and historically they had this political pact with the Shia clerical class. And these two classes actually played a key role in bringing the Islamists to power in 1979. So the fact that the protests began from Bazaar, and the Bazaar in Tehran, which is even more integrated into the Islamic Republic's governance structure, shows in Iran was eating into social bases of the Islamic Republic. I should add that there were people who saw this instigation of the protests from Bazaar as suspect. They saw this as a potential ploy by some faction within the Islamic Republic, which was trying to exploit the utter failure of the incumbent government in terms of economy and foreign policy to grab more power and wealth in the distribution of these two precious commodities within the regime. We can't, with any certainty, verify this. But even if this was the case, I think it was extremely risky enterprise, because while the instigation might have been potentially or in principle planned, but in a society in which people are so fed up with the current situation, so angry and so little to lose increasingly, instigating such a protest is always bound to produce unintended consequences, that it goes out of hand, it spreads to everywhere, and more people come in. And so it goes beyond the management by those people who began that. So I think we are at that point. So far, what we have seen is a geographical distribution in which protests have concentrated in southern and southwestern peripheral both politically but also geographically regions, as well as initially Tehran as the capital city and some other big cities. But absent has been, in particular, Kurdistan and Azerbaijan, to a lesser extent Balochistan, although there we have seen some protest. So this is quite interesting, and we can discuss why those regions have opted to stay out. But at the moment, the poor, the Bazaris, university students in those places where there have been protests seem to be at the forefront of the protests.
I would like to ask if you see any similarities between what is happening now and the protests that happened back in 2017, 2018, also in December, and then later in 2019. So we see increasingly shorter intervals between really massive protests on the streets. Do you see what is happening now a continuity of Janjian Azadi revolutionary movement, or do you, other than the forces that you just mentioned, might be absent?
I think any revolutionary uprising of this scale always has multiple driving forces. Nevertheless, at each conjuncture, one particular crisis or contradiction takes center stage. I think today, at the moment, situation rather similar to 2017 you referred to, where a sharp and sudden decline in living conditions, broadly economic circumstances, was the initial and the main force bringing people out. But that doesn't mean that everyone which comes to the streets to protest is driven to the same level by the same dynamic. It's just, as I said, it's the prominence of one factor which stands out in one protest compared to the other. So in Janjian Azadi movement, the moment of instigation itself, the state killing of Jina Amini, meant that even though there were many people who probably were out there because of discontent with the economic situation, which was also very bad at the time as well, but the beginning of the movement and the slogan which became prominent was such that gender hierarchy seemed to be, the key and the most visible element. And it may well be the case that once these current protests persist and Kurdistan eventually joins, we would see a change in the composition of the slogans and its kind of demands. At the moment, it seems to be largely driven initially by this economic hardship, but the political demand which this situation has given rise to is overthrow of the Islamic Republic, which is essentially the same demand which people made in Janjan Azadi movement. It was more about this semantics of the slogans, which is different. One other difference is that this time around, there is a combination of genuine demand for a return of Pahlavi monarchy by some people within Iran, combined with a massive media operation outside Iran to turn the monarchist opposition into the main or even the only credible opposition. And I think this has played some role in the way in which different parts of country have chosen their level of participation in the protests.
Yes, it was really quick, the move from economic demands, and which are not really demands anymore, to the point where the slogans were totally against the supreme leader and the totality of the regime. Can you tell us about the opposition scene? You already mentioned the Pahlavi, and there were slogans on the street for his return, and some slogans actually portray him as the only alternative to the situation. But are there any other forces that are at work in the opposition, either inside Iran? There has been, so in the past 2 days, let's say, there were statements from the teachers' unions, from students, from labor unions and activists in support of the protests, which mostly are not necessarily backing Pahlavi up as an alternative, but they emphasize on their own role as organizations that are already there on the ground. Are there any other forces in the opposition that are challenging this seemingly only alternative?
I mean, the answer to this question has to have two sides. One is that organized political forces which take a position vis-a-vis the protests, and organized political forces which are actively in the actual protests. And I think these are slightly different, because in terms of discursive support, as you mentioned, there were quite a number of trade union type organizations which have issued statements, and this is very important because they're inside the country, but also some political parties, including some Kurdish parties, some of the major Kurdish parties, including PAJAK, Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, and Kamala Party of Iran. These three I have seen, they have issued statements. There might be others I have missed. But in terms of organized political forces actually leading or guiding the protests, I haven't seen enough evidence to suggest that, largely because, as we all know, Islamic Republic has spent everything it had to destroy any organized political force inside Iran. And this has, I think, a large role to play in the fact that celebrity type politicians such as Reza Pahlavi can enter into this stage without any really organized network or organization within Iran, and entirely based on huge media resources which he and his people around him have. As far as he is concerned, I think from the beginning his strategy has been exactly based on this knowledge that he does not have organized bases inside Iran, but it has capitalized on the nostalgia of a generation of Iranians who have no direct memory of political repression under his father. What they remember from documentaries and whatever visual literature produced by pro-monarchy organizations and media is an Iran which was growing fast, industrialized, had a currency which was extremely strong, a passport which was respected, and so on. But nothing about dictatorship or political oppression and so on and so forth. So there is a broad, if you like, nostalgic, emotional attachment to a past which is not quite what they think, at least in political terms. On the other side of it, because of this lack of organization and political, if you like, backbone within Iran, his strategy has been based on a compromise with elements within the Islamic Republic, part of reformists. If you remember in Janjan Azadi movement, Reza Pahlavi was directly talking to IRGC commanders and law enforcement and trying to reassure them that if the regime falls, they will be protected and they are not going to be necessarily, held accountable and so on. And so this is one axis of compromise. So he's relying on an existing force which has everything to lose if the regime falls, and it needs some basis to retain that after the regime has gone. And that is, I think, part of the, I would say, politically reformists within Iran have that capacity. And it is notable that almost all of his advisors are ex-reformists. Reza Pahlavi's advisors and close associates. And some sections of IRGC, which, I think have the same capacity for adjusting to a pro-Western form of government that Jolani has had in Syria. They can very easily actually switch allegiance, but they would benefit from having a external face which is acceptable to the Western states, and that is Reza Pahlavi. The other part of the calculation of Pahlavi, of course, is to present himself to the Americans and as well as Israelis and other Western European countries as the only credible alternative. So it's really, the whole strategy is about backroom deals at the top and having some sort of underground presence, amplified and exaggerated by quite sleek media operation, which we see day in, day out. But in the end of the day, I think the course of events will be decided on the ground, and that, I think that goes without saying. And on the ground, I think there are many more forces which potentially could way outweigh what the monarchists are trying to do at the moment.
Yeah, and at the very least, the people living in small and impoverished and marginalized cities, the names of which we haven't heard by now, and now we see this mass protests in the cities. Back to the overthrow of the regime. This is not new, and Trump has been tweeting every single time that there was a wave of protest that we stand by the Iranian people. Netanyahu has done the same during the Janjan Azadi revolutionary movement. He has sent also video messages to the great people of Iran, addressing the people and making this divide that the war is with the government and not with you. And with this time, we have the tweet from the Farsi account of Mossad saying that not only are we supporting you, but also we are with you on the street, which is already, I would say, a security threat to the people on the street, who are going to be later accused of being Mossad spies based on this tweet. So now Trump has actually invaded Venezuela and overthrown the government, and Maduro and his wife has been flown out of the country. Do you think there is a message for Iran in this invasion?
Yeah, there is definitely a message, even if it wasn't intended, because if you combine Trump's tweet about coming to the rescue of Iranians if they are killed by the regime security forces, and then within days the abduction of Maduro happened in Venezuela, they will, connect the dots and make their own kind of conclusions. Having said that, I think there is a major difference between the two cases insofar as the United States is concerned. I think what happened in Venezuela is very clearly, you can read out of the recently published National Security Strategy of the United States, in which it very explicitly says that we will revive the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, according to which Latin America is United States sphere of influence, which has to be kept out of reach for US competitors, in this case China, and unfriendly governments should not predominate in the region. And Venezuela was obviously the weakest of this series of, more or less left-wing governments in the region. Brazil, Lula, Colombia and Uruguay have all left-leaning governments which have close connection with American competitors. So in the larger strategy of the United States, this was expected, I would say, and it's not out of ordinary. And it goes back really for a long time. In 1989, Manuel Noriega, the leader of Panama, was actually abducted or captured by US forces in Panama itself and flown back to US, tried on the charges of narcotic related charges and so on and so forth. So this current one is very similar. But Iran, if the national security strategy document is anything to go by, and I think it has to be the basis of analysis, is that United States is unlikely to commit force into a country like Iran, except for very targeted operations, such as what it did in the 12-day war, attacking nuclear sites. They may well actually directly target supreme leader. I mean, these are not out of question, but the US is highly unlikely to engage in a war whose end is not in its own control. I mean, Trump is, and the United States is very much averse to a repeat of Afghanistan or Iraq or anything like that. However, and that's where things get very complicated, because Israel has very different set of calculations. Israel needs US in order to attack Iran. And in order to have US on board, it has to convince it. But Israel has really, it doesn't care what comes next. So long as IRI is gone and the threat of Iran, the missile and nuclear project threat is gone, it is not a urgent issue for them at all who comes to power. So I would say that even in case of Pahlavi, they do know that he doesn't have the basis for what it claims to have. And yet for the Americans to be convinced to commit, they need to present him as the credible alternative. And once the regime has fallen, who cares, in their view, who comes to power, even though they might do everything they can to bring someone they like or they prefer. So I think that's a calculation. And in the 12-day war, as you mentioned, they openly asked people to come to the streets. Nothing happened, as one might have expected. So this time around, Trump has said, you killed protesters, we come in, and have been already multiple casualties. So, maybe it's early to say, but we haven't seen anything yet. But I mean, from a strategic point of view, they probably want to see how long the protests go on and then make a decision in terms of, because so long as the protests are happening in this scale, why would complicate things by a military attack? But I think there might come a moment that they might calculate that an attack will actually deliver the last blow to the regime, but that doesn't seem to be now at the moment.
I would like to ask as the last question about the post you have written, and you have made a similarity between what is happening now on the streets with early days of February 1979, right before the what came to be the victory of the Islamic Revolution. Why do you think it's so, and what does that mean for the Iranian people?
I mean, when I was watching the footages coming out of at least certain parts of Iran last night, you saw that people captured police stations, seized arms. There were actually armed people on the streets in some parts of Iran. And I think this is just indicative of, on the one hand, the determination of the protesters, and also clearly a fall in the degree of cohesion of the security establishment, because surely they could open fire indiscriminately and protect themselves, but this hasn't happened. Now, we don't know the details, but most revolutions happen not when an absolute majority of the population is just fed up and comes to the street. So long as a state is able and willing to kill, it's unlikely to fall, because they always have more killing power than unarmed protesters. But the moment that the first cracks appear in the repressive organs of a state, I think that shows not only that the foot soldiers might have doubts about killing of people, but also it means something has happened in the decision-making metabolism of the state itself. There are some doubts. There are people who might think, okay, this is a lost cause, better to pack our bags and maybe go. And this is like an avalanche. You just need one person to defect, and things go, can go very rapidly down. So maybe my post was a bit premature, but if such scenes repeat itself in different cities, especially in the large cities, I don't see how it can stop. I mean, imagine in Tehran, a couple of police stations are captured, people getting armed. I don't know, state TV is captured, and given the dire circumstances of the country, given the lack of any prospect for the regime itself and for people as well, things can unravel very quickly. So I think that parallel was at least obvious to me last night, but there was differences too. Obviously, the 1979 revolution was one in which the negative, if you like, the negative dimension, the demand for the departure of the Shah was so powerful and so forceful. But at the same time, there was this charismatic figure of Khomeini, who, relying on really broad network of support with Bazaar and the mosques and clerical establishment, was able to really provide a future beyond it in positive terms. At the moment, we don't have anything like that. I mean, on the one hand, the lack of a charismatic politics might be a good thing, so individuals don't confiscate a revolution. On the other hand, it also means that the task of creating a discourse around which a majority of the people can, gather, becomes more difficult and challenging. So there are all these fractures politically and socially and so on. But revolutions are by definition unpredictable. Otherwise, no revolution would ever happen. So we have to wait and see how things grow and develop on the ground. And I think much depends on local organizations you refer to in one of the questions, trade unions, neighborhood organizations, cultural institutions, and so on and so forth, and university students, for that matter, very important as well as schools in general. So there is much to look for or to watch at the moment, but surely this is a very significant protest movement, and the regime is truly shaken.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matin, for your time.
Thank you.